Hello everyone and welcome to the Kingdom Yoga podcast. This is a solo episode today by me. So it seemed apt in the light of recent tragic circumstances that we consider again what makes tradition, the traditional Ashtanga, and the roots of Ashtanga coming from Krishnamacharya as we know. And he was the father of Vinyasa. So my perspective, before I get on further, that Vinyasa really is the roots of modern yoga altogether. So my thinking is, if we know Vinyasa, then we really know the foundations of modern yoga practice, which is not Vinyasa in the popular mind, by the way. Yeah? So today, I should have introduced this before, it's going to be on Vinyasa. My understanding of Vinyasa, which may not be the same as yours, but hopefully it piques your interest a little bit, and why it is so seminal as the heart of modern yoga, really. The reason it was popular in the first place, because pre-20th century, really we find static postures. I mean, there are a couple of texts that do suggest movements that are found in the Mysore library, namely the Hatha, Vinyasa, Padati, suggest movements between the postures, but certainly there doesn't seem to be a tradition of teaching a movement-based yoga. All the texts, all the Hatha yogis are doing static postures with more interest in mudra and bandha, let's say, and intense pranayama than moving and flowing in any kind of sequence that resembles modern yoga. So Krishnamacharya is a real innovator in the 20th century, bringing this technique of vinyasa and instigating the whole of modern yoga, which has now perhaps gone slightly astray when we talk of vinyasa yoga, because vinyasa, as we should see, is not exactly the vinyasa of Krishnamacharya's idea. He may be turning in his grave to see how modern vinyasa is used as a kind of flowing sequence to music, etc., etc. Anyway, we'll come to that in a second. So, yes, as I said, Vinyasa signifies to me the modernness of modern yoga, which is definitely a question that's dear to my heart. Where does it come from? Well, actually, Krishnamacharya was an innovator here as well, and in many respects. And he did something which is a very common thing seen in the Indian tradition, because you can't be seen to innovate anything, because obviously if you're innovating, then it's come from you, and no tradition just comes from a person. It's all based, especially in India, I think, but anywhere really, tradition is always based on a historical precedent. So you have to find a precedent in the past, don't you? You have to find something in the past where they're suggesting something that you can say, well, no, nothing, I'm not doing anything new. This is actually historical precedent that I'm just following now. I'm just including this perspective on the text, and I'm translating it to the modern context. Why I say that is that there's many different streams of yoga, and so you could probably find many different interpretations. So they need to find one interpretation from one stream, and he needed to find vinyasa, basically. I mean, well, now it's easy to say that looking back, but I feel that taking the yoga to the modern population, there was a serious conundrum in Krishnamacharya's mind. How do you do this to preserve the inner technique of yoga, but make it in a way that was interesting to them? And they could do it. They could actually do it. And holding postures for long periods of time is not interesting to the modern person, let's say. It doesn't suit our temperament, it doesn't suit the dynamism of life. And as Sri Yogendra of Mumbai said himself, they found it too difficult. I mean, Sri Yogendra was probably actually the first modern yoga teacher before Krishnamacharya. Certainly Sri Yogendra taught the general public, whereas Krishnamacharya first of all taught his young boys in the Mysore palace. Anyway, we've got to go back first of all to where Krishnamacharya found this term in the first place. And if we look back in history, as I said, we certainly don't find it used to describe yoga in any respects, or let's say yoga asana, to be more specific. We don't find it in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, the Grunda Samhita, or any text on Tantric Hatha Yoga. So where do we find it? We find it in rituals. Yeah. So it's apparently, and I don't know exactly the etymology of the word. I mean, I think Patabi Joyce used to quote this, "Oh, yogi, don't do yoga without vinyasa." And he said it was from Vamana Rishi. I don't know the origin of the text. Perhaps you might be able to point that out to me, guys, more scholarly guys than me. But nevertheless, what I do know is that the word vinyasa was used for rituals, to describe doing the ritual in the right order, in the right place. Particularly, I believe, the placement of certain mantras, saying the mantra in certain parts of the body, I understand. And some scholars will argue against this. There's one notable scholar that argues against this, that vinyasa was always used to designate ritual movement practices, namely Surya Namaskar, I think is the argument here that the scholar is using. But nevertheless, he's out on his own there. And generally it's said that Krishnamacharya did appropriate, you see, there's always been appropriation. He did appropriate this word, vinyasa, from the use of rituals to using in modern asana. Right, so, and it means, as people say, special placement or significant placement, something like that. Again, there's different translations of the term. Nevertheless, it's him that creates its usage in this manner, right? Which is kind of confusing because yes, it existed before, but not in this context. And that's the same with so many aspects of Indian philosophy, right? Where they take things from a text, use it in a slightly different context where it would mean a slightly different thing. So no one's ever changed or innovated anything, yet the tradition keeps growing, right? A very clever little trope. Anyway, so Krishnamacharya at the start of the 20th century, well, he was faced with a problem just like Sri Yogendra was faced with a problem, and probably Swami Kaivalyananda, who was the third innovator at the start of the 20th century. He was the founder of Kaivalyadam Institute in Lonavala, Mumbai. He was probably faced with a problem as well. The problem was how to translate yoga, Hatha yoga, to the modern context because these teachers were the first, it seems like, to teach the general public yoga. Whereas previous to that, there was a tradition of Hatha or asana, but it was for ascetics, for those in monasteries, or it's a private practice. Initiated to certain householders, a tantric practice, or it was used as a nature cure, in ashrams, part of Ayurveda, really, healing. So there wasn't really a tradition of popular usage of asana for the general public, funnily enough, right? So what they found was that, well, something had to change because you couldn't get people sitting for hours in one position, like Krishnamacharya originally suggesting the Yoga Makaranda. Certain postures could be done for, I think he said the Mayurasana could be done for an hour at a time. And he says many things in there, and sometimes contradictory as well, by the way. Definitely worth a read, Yoga Makaranda. Definitely look it up. It's a PDF. You can get it online, as I often say. Download it, and it really informs you a great deal in how we got to where we do today. So Krishnamacharya, faced with this conundrum, and he chooses vinyasa to preserve the technique of Hatha yoga. Right? So how does he do that? Right? What does vinyasa mean in terms of preserving this technique? Right. So now we move on to the meat of this podcast. First of all, it stands for being methodical. Right? Special placement, building up bit by bit. And if you're teaching general public, they probably wouldn't be used to this methodicalness of approach with the body. Yep. And a lot of the yoga, a lot of what we do is related to this very careful use of the body in a ritual-like fashion, right? We're not just doing one thing then the next. And that's, I suppose, where perhaps the modern use of vinyasa slightly drifts off the path. And I may not say it's wrong. I'm not saying it's wrong at all. Just say it's not the use of the vinyasa that Krishnamacharya intended, where it's much more start and stop rather than flow. So where modern vinyasa means flow, getting into a flow, getting into the flow state, using music even, different sequences, Krishnamacharya was really pointing out the start and the stop. Because a ritual, if we think of what ritual is, it's defining a certain space, coming into a certain space where things aren't as they normally are. Yeah? So it's a sacred space of possibility to change, right? To transform. That's the use of ritual. And it's the basis of every religion that's ever existed, right? First of all, you have rituals to get into a space where you have this plasticity of consciousness in order to change one's perception, perhaps radically. Yeah. But how to do that, you have to come out of everyday life slightly and out of the kind of habitual rules and ways of looking things that dictate our quotidian, our daily existence, right? So that's why in traditional cultures, all traditional cultures as well, you've got lay rituals, sorry. What do I mean by that? Just rituals that aren't religious, like rituals that are around festivals or eating. I mean, often they're tied to religious because all rituals that take you out of your consciousness to something else do have a spiritual significance. But some of them are slightly, let's say, left-handed or slightly different. Say carnival, for example, a certain ritual of getting oneself out of one's normal consciousness, but not exactly spiritual, we might say, in the normal sense of the word anyways. But if we look at it deeper, perhaps this exposing the darker side or the let's say the imagination side is a spiritual ritual in the end. But there are many, many rituals that we might do in everyday life, and we probably still can think, if we think carefully about our own rituals, why we do them. Well, one is for stability, regulating the mind, putting the mind onto the body, putting the mind onto action, brings it back into the center of your experience, right? So that's one thing. The other thing, as I was suggesting, is this idea of defining a space. And this is what really separates Krishnamacharya's use of vinyasa, let's say, to modern vinyasa, which is more about getting into a flow. And it certainly was my experience, as I mentioned before in my podcast on Shratji. When I went to Mysore, the first thing I noticed about Pattabhi Jois when he counted the lead class is it wasn't a flow. When I was counted through at home by Western teachers in the UK, I couldn't even hardly break up the postures. It seemed like one long flow, jump through, jump back, posture. And I was interested in the flow more than the posture, if you see what I mean. In fact, I was more interested, like a lot of us are, in the flowing, in the jump through, jump back part, the linking part, the flowing part, rather than the postures themselves. Yeah? So I treated it like a flow and wanted to get into the flow. And there's nothing wrong with that because it kept me going. And it keeps a lot of us going, getting into the flow. Also kind of gets you out of yourself. But getting us out of ourselves into a flow is also potentially to lose ourselves, whereas ritual is to come back to the self. So how does it do that? In a certain sense, in the opposite way. To complete the story, when I went to Mysore, Pattabhi Jois counting through, there's no better way to say this than it was a very jerky start and stop. Jump forward, sit down. Posture, inhale, forward fold, exhale. I said the name of the posture in Sanskrit, obviously. Anyways, stop, didn't say that, stop, pause, always say like, okay, panch the shah, look up, exhale, there was another pause, sap the shah, cross the legs, start the shah, jump back, it's like that, that's the counting in Sanskrit. So it wasn't the flow, it seemed purposefully to be very stoppy and starty, as I said before, staccato is the only way I could describe it. It didn't have a rhythm exactly, and my sense of the understanding of why that was is that every posture acts as a mini point of stillness surrounded by movement. And I think one factor that Krishnamacharya and his contemporaries, Yogendra, Kavalinanda, probably realized was that it's really hard to get people into stillness through simply stillness. I mean, it begs the question, if you could just meditate, then you would. The problem is that when we sit down, the mind starts running around. So we don't feel still, even though we're sitting still. The same with yoga postures. It's hard to get into the stillness of a posture just by holding a rigid static posture. It's easier when we contrast it with movement. Just like doing a load of exercise, for example, then you sit down and you're quiet or you lie down, you feel very still. The same with the postures, movement and stop, movement and stop. In that same manner, between the highlighting of the movement and stop, what it does is it designates the quiet space of the posture between the movement. So it carves out and supports, both supporting and designating the coming into a ritual space potentially. So that's my understanding, or one understanding anyway, because there's other things to come, of what Krishnamacharya was trying to do with this vinyasa, like trying to get consciousness to slow down, and by playing with movement and stasis, because movement is our quest for being, right? Yep. We look at continental philosophers such as Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, in his Being and Nothingness. He talks of two states that we can have. We can either be or be something, becoming. Being and becoming, he talks about. Now, becoming is movement. Being is impossible to recognize. Only in contrast to not trying to become, not moving, can we recognize being. So there's something that helps us recognize our own state between the constant movement and stopping, between our constant wish to become and then the absence of that for a period. I know that might sound a little bit complicated, but perhaps look at it practically next time you practice, and maybe between the start and the stop, you'll get the feeling that it helps see something behind the start and the stop. Maybe it's something that's enduring, something that doesn't have a start and a stop. I don't know. I'll leave that question up in the air for you to answer right now. Anyway, there's other reasons why Krishnamacharya would have used vinyasa, and the fundamental one really. So the second fundamental thing that defines modern yoga, this is about breathing. Right? And it's not a popular thing to point out, but pre-20th century, really, asana and pranayama was about not breathing. Right? Kumbhaka, breath retentions, that was the point of the breathing, to not breathe. So it's ironic that asana now stands for breathing when originally we were training ourselves not to breathe through asana. And I think it's very relevant because we need breathing more than ever these days. And to stop the breathing when we're not feeling stable or equanimous these days generally, and to try and do those long breath holds, I'm not sure is that helpful or relevant now in the modern context anyway. Nevertheless, let's go back to the point. So now, if yoga has become more about breathing and moving, and rather than not breathing and not moving, right, which is the dramatic modernization that Krishnamacharya was definitely a forerunner of, then vinyasa is how to define that change, right? I was going to say something else there. You can't exactly keep a complete line. Generally speaking, I think I do quite well, right? Right, it'll come back to me in a second. So, if vinyasa is the fundamental tool for breathing, what does it signify? Right, and it signifies two things, right? One, the use of the diaphragm, and second, a rhythm. Now, rhythm in breath is fundamental because creating a rhythm through the diaphragm, right, you pacify the nervous system. Right? You get into a state which is calmer through creating a breath rhythm. Also, it said creating a rhythm in the body, something to do with cerebral spinal fluid and the changes that occur in the energy of the body through making a rhythm to the organs and the way that the water runs through the body. That's a little bit more esoteric, and that I found in a book on Tantra recently, that possibility of the importance of rhythm. But we've always used rhythm. After all, we've always used rhythm in every culture. Rhythm is soothing, healing, cathartic, and every traditional movement system, indigenous movement system, is a dance based on rhythm. So creating this idea of vinyasa, which is, I said it was a choppy start and stop, but it was also still a kind of rhythm there. It wasn't exactly a flow, but it had a kind of pendulum kind of flow to it, like that. So one, vinyasa, a use of rhythm, trying to instigate rhythm in the body. For the nervous system, for the sake of regulating the nervous system. Secondly, the use of vinyasa, what I'm most interested in, I suppose, because I'm most interested in the diaphragm really, and the utter fundamental focus of the diaphragm in Hatha yoga, as I see it anyway. What Krishnamacharya was trying to do with the vinyasa is he was trying to lead us to understanding the diaphragm. I suppose before that, in trying to get some kind of counting, he was just trying to get the individual interested in the breathing in the first place. Right? And as I always say, in counting the asana through, it's as good and it works as well in the observance as in the breach. In other words, if you know you've missed a count, that's just as helpful as doing the count, because the point is you're observing the breathing. And observing the breathing when you miss a count is exactly the same as sticking to the count. It just gives you this constant throwback on the breathing. Right? So first of all, vinyasa gets you into the breathing, but second of all, it shows you the movement of the diaphragm. How does it do that? Because Krishnamacharya is constantly playing with open and closed shapes. Right? So look at sun salutation A, for example. Inhale, raise the arms, that's an open shape, in extension of the back. Exhale, fold forward, that's a closed shape, a flexion of the back. Inhale, look up again, extension of the back. Exhale is chaturanga, slight, I wouldn't exactly say flexion, but nevertheless. Certainly in upward dog, we've got extension, open shape, and in downward dog, you've got a flexion, slight flexion of the back in a closed shape. So constantly playing with these two shapes in the body, because you see it, then you see it through every other asana posture. Is open, close, right? Flexion, extension. The diaphragm is fundamental in the expression of extension and flexion. So in understanding the two postures, you understand the two movements of the diaphragm. As you inhale, if you're using the diaphragm, which is the idea of breathing in yoga, right, the fundamental use of the diaphragm, because we breathe anyway, right? And we breathe partly using the diaphragm generally anyway, but in Hatha yoga, this is tantamount to use just the diaphragm. And when you do that and the inhale, the diaphragm goes into extension. It draws downwards towards the abdomen, if you breathe fully into it. And that naturally allows the hands, it naturally almost lifts the spine and draws the arms up if you let it. And then when the diaphragm pulls back into flexion, it naturally pulls the body together, closes the body. So you see, every movement in Krishnamacharya's vinyasa mirrors the movement of the diaphragm. So in doing the movements on the outside of the body, like in a very obvious way, you can start to see like a parody, like a mirror, like a reflection, can start to see the movements of the diaphragm in doing this. So these playing with the open, closed shapes in the body starts to show the individual the breathing, the diaphragm, the use of the diaphragm. And as I said, that's utterly fundamental in Hatha Yoga, and Krishnamacharya recognized that as well. And all his talk in the Makaranda about breathing. And when I said he was faced with the conundrum at the start of the podcast, that he was faced with the conundrum of how to preserve Hatha Yoga technique with modern people in a general public context, and his use of Vinyasa was the answer. This was the reason, because in the use of Vinyasa gets people into the diaphragm and breathing diaphragmatically. And when you breathe diaphragmatically, you start to do, it's twofold. One, create a rhythm in the body, and that is tantric because it affects the nervous system. Two, use the diaphragm to affect different pressures in the cavities of the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity. Right? Often, in fact, yoga can be called, and historically in different texts, is called Gata. Like in the Yajnavalkya, he calls it Gata Yoga, I believe. And there's another text that just called the body Gata. And what does Gata mean? It means a pot. Yeah, the pot is full of air. The pot is full of space. The body is full of space. Changing the pressure in this space, in other words, the air pressure, through usage of the diaphragm, you change the mentality or basically the neurosynaptic connections in the brain. Yeah? So that's what you do with Hatha Yoga. Use the body to affect a drastic, not drastic in a negative sense, but a radical, let's say, a radical effect on the mind. Yeah? By the pressure, by playing with air pressure in the body. Yeah? That's one rendering of the method of Hatha Yoga, using our modern perspectives, let's say. Because they'll also talk about Kundalini or preservation of Bindu. But one way you could look at it or interpret the tradition of Hatha is this pressurizing the Gata, pressurizing the pot. Yeah, baking, they often call it firing the pot or baking the pot. Yeah, and the diaphragm on its drawing in inflection on a full exhale puts the thoracic cavity, because you're trying to breathe in yoga into the upper cavity of the body, not the lower. Yeah, it's more because there's more pressure there. Yeah. And there's other reasons. The vagus nerve lies closer to the upper body, so you can stimulate this area than the lower. And it's also stabilizing if you're going to do asana as well. Anyways, so on the exhale, the diaphragm draws up and in, and it puts the body into negative pressure. Yeah. On the inhale, the diaphragm draws in and down, puts the body into positive pressure. So what you're doing here is a kind of light version, in a sense, of all the breath retention and the holding of the asana in pre-20th century Hatha Yoga, because Kambakas do exactly the same thing. You hold the breath either on the inhale or the exhale, but it's intense. Yeah? Maybe more intense than the general public want to or should handle. So Krishnamacharya does a lighter version of this, prioritizing the diaphragm through this method, making it attractive to people, but nevertheless preserving that fundamental essence of the method, which is to change the mind through recourse to playing with pressure in the body, yet using the muscle of the diaphragm. And that, as I said before, is nothing other than to talk about bandha, because the way the diaphragm is controlled is through the use of the lower abdomen and perineum. Right? So if you don't use that, if you were to breathe fully, it would just breathe, and you could without bandha breathe into the abdomen using the diaphragm. That's called a belly breath. But we're trying to breathe thoracically because it's much more pressurized. As I said, the breath is trying to go in the upper body because of the stimulating effects there. Right? So if you're going to try and breathe in the thoracic cavity, as I mentioned in a previous podcast, and not the abdominal cavity, then you've got to use the lower abdomen and the pelvic floor in such a way to do so. Right? And this means that what you do is you kind of grab hold of the diaphragm at its origin. The cord that connects the belly of the diaphragm. And using that, by using the lower abdomen, you freeze that area. Right? And now you can use the diaphragm from its insertion where it attaches, which is the rib cage. Like any muscle, and I've mentioned this before, you can use it from its origin or its insertion. So if you were to breathe in the belly, you'll be stabilizing the insertion, the rib cage, and letting the origin, the belly of the diaphragm, move up and down. The belly would stick out. If you do the yoga breathing, thoracic breathing, you stabilize the origin, the middle of the diaphragm, and you make the diaphragm move from its insertion where it attaches on the rib cage, using bandha. So bandha is for the sake of the diaphragm. If you don't understand that, then because it is a bit complicated, we can do it in person sometimes if you come to a workshop. But this is a fundamental thing to understand, the use of the diaphragm and how to control it through bandha, and what a difference it does actually make in physical practice. Because without the pressure in the internal body, in the end, I have to say, the yoga shapes are just shapes. Yeah. When you start to understand the kind of way to make a correct or right tension, the right kind of tension or pressure in the body, everything does change quite a lot from there. Anyway, so that's my understanding of the modern use of vinyasa, and how it does fundamentally differ from modern. How I'd rather rephrase that. it's my understanding of how modern Vinyasa was used by Krishnamacharya, not how modern Vinyasa is used today, which signifies rather just getting into a flow. And as I said, we all are getting into a flow, me as much as the next person, right? But I'll do it outside yoga, because I think yoga is in a way trying to break the flow. It's trying to define the space between the start and the stop, get you into that space where we have, let's call it limbic, intermediate. Limbic is often the word to define an intermediary space with possibilities, that's open to possibilities, and bring us outside of normal life, which is ritual, defining the sacred space, a limbic space of possibility. That allows you to see the self a lot more clearly than, say, getting into the flow in a yoga class or a game of football, for example, or something else, the gym, where you kind of lose yourself, which is great, because the pressure of being with yourself all the time is heavy. And we need that too, I think, to lose ourselves. But it's not yoga. It's not the idea of yoga, which is to reflect the self, to see the self, to try and come back into it rather than go away from it. Yeah. And as I say, I think we need the both, but with the yoga, the vinyasa use that we have now in the popular mind, anyway, in the popular yoga world, to just simply escape the self, is to undermine or to shortchange the original intention of yoga, that was to try and define a ritual space and keep it separate. So that's to say that perhaps our use of flow states don't need to be done in yoga, because we can really get them in so many other places that we don't need to define it in yoga as well, just to come into a flow with music. So Krishnamacharya, kind of 100%, 180 degrees opposed in his perspective, I feel, to the way that modern vinyasa, is used these days. But so be it. We just coming into the self and looking at the self, coming back to the self, is a little bit heavy. If you hadn't noticed, it's a little bit of responsibility. It's quite a burden. It's more than understandable that we do seek the flow state. Nevertheless, I'm not sure that's what Krishnamacharya originally intended. And as well as that, the flow state, when you look at modern asana, the flow of modern asana is very dispersive. The energy is dispersed in long flowing movements, soft, long sweeping movements. Whereas you look at Krishnamacharya's yoga, or the yoga before, it's very tight. Yeah, it's the pressure. The pressure is there. We're looking to pressurize the body, not disperse energy from the body. We're looking to put energy towards the spine rather than let energy flow away from the spine. Anyway, I think that's probably enough from me today. As always, let me know what you think. Let me know if you have any guests in mind that I haven't interviewed yet. It's not on purpose. I'm kind of random in how I tend to find guests, really. And finally, I have to mention I'm doing a retreat in Bali in February, I believe, end of February. You can find it on the website, and I've still got places. I'd love to see you there. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll be happy to answer them. Otherwise, I'll see you next week for another great podcast, and have a good week. Bye for now. Namo Namah.